percent of the conservative religious right vote in 2016. Wonder how many would rescind that vote today? Let's talk about that right now here on the Atheist Forum. You are about to enter the no superstition zone of rational thinking and intellectual curiosity here on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340. He's had 2 wives age out. He's committed adultery twice that we know of. He covets everything in sight. He is a man consumed with monetary greed and gluttony. He has no concept of humility, harboring an unjustifiably inflated ego that would certainly be diagnosed as mentally unstable by any professional mental health counselor. He's a man totally lacking in compassion for any except his immediate family. He violates as many as 7 of the 10 commandments with regularity and is, of course, our false witness in chief, having told some 6,000 lies now, only 2 years into office. This is the candidate supported by the conservative religious right by some 81% in 2016. And now that they know the true lack of character of this mucking foron, will they vote for him again? Well, of course they will, because they are hypocrites, or more realistically, hypocrites on steroids, so much so that we've had to concoct a new term to describe the religious right in America today: hypercrites. Ed Golly with Joe Reinhardt, Jim Peterson, the Tan Talk studio, where you can offer up your opinion on the program today. Just pick up the phone, dial 441-3000. We'd be glad to talk to you. Joe? Jim?
Yeah, that number for those who hypocritically support this person has actually dropped. It used to be 45% just less than a year ago. Now it's 39% and dropping.
Yes.
So it does testify that, people do eventually learn their lesson.
Well, the 81% of white Christian evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, those percentages have held pretty steady, in spite of the fact, again, that he regularly breaks the 10 Commandments, or at least most of them, hourly, if not daily. On the other hand, they rationalize that, at least the ones I've heard, by saying that, oh yeah, we know he's a total scumbag, but we're convinced, I think largely from the pulpit, that he's an instrument of God, that God is using Donald Trump, that Donald Trump doesn't even know it himself, that the Lord works in mysterious ways,
Exceedingly.
and that this is just another sign that the end of the world, the end times, are imminent, and we should all be prepared to be vaporized in short order. So.
Isn't that the same pulpit that assures us all that we're all sinners? So he's just a little bit more sinner than the rest of us, slightly.
Yes.
So it's perfectly acceptable.
Well, and then they
No
cite
problem.
the example of Christ himself, who was reviled by his contemporaries for associating with tax collectors and prostitutes. And he had 3 women, at least one of whom was a former prostitute, who traveled in his entourage.
Although you can be sure that this man does his best not to associate with tax collectors.
Right.
For 20 years. So if he's supposedly sent by this purported God, why does he violate so many of the commandments that these Christians think are so important? For example, thou shalt have no other gods before me. I would assert his God is money, wouldn't you, Joe? I mean, he doesn't. He's not a religious man. He can't tell you what's in
I think
the Bible or the.
As they once said about
Even these
Disraeli,
commandments.
that he was a self-made man and he worshipped his creator.
Yeah. Thou shalt not make any graven image. What about that fake Time News magazine cover that he created
Well,
showing?
and the painting of himself that his charity bought.
Yes, those are graven images by definition, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, I think, however, he could not be accused of self-creation because a lot of the credit for his creation belongs to the NBC producer who put together The Apprentice, on which his so-called reputation is largely based.
And at the risk of erroneously correcting you, isn't that his former charity, since the state attorney
Yes.
general of New York is going to
Right.
slam the door on that because he's so abusing the funds? Remember the Sabbath day? Was he working on Sunday trying to get a deal together?
I don't think he knows what Sabbath
No,
means.
I don't either. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Need I say more? Thou shalt not steal. Trump, you was a textbook example of him stealing.
Sounds like an implication.
Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Well, I guess against the country, he sees it different. Maybe, I don't know.
I would describe Donald Trump as a liar of biblical proportions.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that would be fair. Yes.
And it was just insulting what he did over in the Middle East with the troops, claiming he was going to give them a 10% raise when and it's all because of him. He's
They
not.
get one automatically every year for the last 20 years.
And he said
Trump
they hadn't
has
had anything
nothing
for
to
10
do
years.
with it.
Yeah. Just, the guy is so pathological that I think his version of the truth is simply whatever he pulls out of his, yeah.
Too bad. Tough
Right?
deal.
Racks.
I mean, he doesn't care what truth is, and then when the media calls him out on it, they become the enemy of the people and the false news purveyors. Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. Are you kidding me? This guy's.
Coveter
He
in
is,
chief.
and yet the religious right continues to embrace him. This is, and that's why hypocrisy simply doesn't serve to define this movement in our country. It's hypocrisy on steroids. It's
I'm sure they say,
hyperocracy.
they would claim that he serves a larger purpose.
Yeah.
Like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yeah,
That's all an
clean up the
instrument of.
countryside.
Yeah, that's right.
See this item the other day in the paper about the daughters of the deceased podiatrist? Says it's family lore that their father, which would be, I think you would call that what is it, an urban legend, that their father helped Trump long before he became president avoid being drafted for military service in Nam. The daughters of the physician said their father, as a favor, provided the fall 1968 diagnosis of bone spurs that helped Trump get a medical exemption.
He couldn't remember which foot
Exactly.
had the bone spurs, and he has justly earned the title, the sobriquet, sobriquet
Oh,
sobriquet.
yes.
of, yes,
Yeah.
Cadet Bone Spurs.
Yeah.
was
He
his
received
title.
4 deferments from the draft while studying at Fordham in the University of Pennsylvania, although he had been found fit for duty during an examination in 1966 and had been a football and basketball player at New York Military Academy. That's fascinating, isn't it? But then again,
Mickey Mantle was not eligible for the draft because he had a bone problem. So it is possible, but highly unlikely.
Well, it'd be safe to say he was spurred on to.
Spurred
greater
on.
well,
achievement.
what I think is
Greater
intriguing is
things.
that how many, these conservatives are always so pro-military, right? And yet they look to leadership from people who are chicken hawks, whether it was Dan Quayle, President Cheney was he got like 4 deferments.
He had other priorities.
And now Trump, yeah. And these guys won't, they're never going to put themselves in harm's way, but they have no problem putting your kids or you or me there for the profit of the military-industrial complex.
Well, their talents were too valuable to the nation.
Uh-huh.
They can't be expected to put themselves in harm's way.
They're also cowards. They don't
Well,
want
that
to
helps too.
risk it. Yeah, that helps a lot. So anyway, hyperocracy reigns in the culture today. Now we can only speculate with apparently the Mueller investigation's going to come to a conclusion very early next year, in 2019. And the California representative from Burbank, Adam Schiff,
Sure.
is likely to be really implementing a serious investigation of Mr. Trump's tax returns. He should be able to get that. We're going to start to find out all about the Russian collusion that our pathological false witness in chief keeps claiming. Never happened.
I'd be willing
Boy, I
to bet
believe
your
him.
life. I'd be willing to bet your life that's the smoking gun that we've all been waiting for is Trump's taxes.
I'll take
Yes,
that bet.
that exposes everything, really.
Well, you're listening to the Atheist Forum, believe it or not, here on the Tan Talk Radio Network, and we'd love to hear from you at 441-3000. Our toll-free number is, read that for us, Joe, 866.
826-1340, just like the call numbers, 1340, 826-1340, and the toll-free extension is 866-826-1340. Call us.
And I'll tell you what to call them. For those of us over 60, it's hard to believe that it's been a half a century since Apollo 8 first took the 3 astronauts up to circle the moon a few times as they were preparing for the eventual Apollo 11 moon landing. And they did at this time, 50 years ago in 1968, they were making their journey around the moon. They orbited it. I was fascinated. I saw an article on it last night on Nova. They couldn't even actually see the moon as they were approaching it because the back of the ship was pointed to the moon so they could engage the thruster and slow down and go into the orbit. So I wonder, wouldn't that be awkward flying along? You can't even see what you're heading toward.
Well, they were one of the first people, though, to see the back of the moon.
Yes.
Which is
Although
truly
photos had been made of it from orbiting spacecraft in the past, but
That's right.
But they were the first people to actually see it as living people instead of just
Turned out to be
photos.
pretty much like the other side.
Well,
I
actually,
don't think
it
so.
isn't.
It's a little more.
Yeah, it's got more craters and fewer mare, the dark spots, the so-called mare or seas, and they suspect that is the case because the object which we call the moon actually is a piece of debris from a collision between early planet Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, and another celestial body.
Yeah, it used to be part of the planet Earth, so
That's right. That's why its soils
I have no
and so forth are
first-hand
much
knowledge
like the Earth.
of that. But
Yeah. Well,
Well,
so they say.
4 years later, the famous blue marble image, which is one of the most reproduced photographs in human history, came from Apollo 17. But for Commander Borman and McLeish alike, what Earthrise revealed wasn't a marble made vast, but a planet made small. A little blue sphere, a child's precious agate floating alone in the abyss of space. So much later, Carl Sagan would pick up this line of thought in his 1994 book, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space, in which the Earth, as photographed in 1990 from Voyager 1 at that time, some 3,700,000,000 miles away from Earth, became, quote, a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, unquote. For Sagan, this new image challenged the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe. This is something that's always intrigued me about religion, how it asserts that our planet and our species are the center of the entire universe. Understandable, because when these ideas were thought of, they really had no idea what stars even were. Sure. They didn't know how far away they were, what they meant. They didn't understand that sun is just another star. And so it was, since this was, their universe was limited by what they could see, and even more so by what they could understand, it makes sense that they would think of themselves as the center of everything.
Religions tend to do much better when they talk about or make statements concerning things that can't be empirically investigated. The minute they start saying anything that can be quantified or learned or counted, they get into quite a bit of a problem. And when we look at the statements that they have made about the structure of the universe and our own planet and the age of the planet and the animals, etc., based on the accuracy of those statements that can be investigated, it would be just about impossible to underestimate the value of any other value judgments or statements they have to make on any other subject.
Very well said, yes.
Thank you, Robert Ingersoll.
Yeah, part of
Doing a little Ivanka Trump plagiarizing there, aren't you? That's fine. Might as well get into the spirit of the political agenda today.
right.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Part of the, I read this article too, and I was much taken by it. And part of the reason why religion keeps showing up in this is that it offers the possibility of citing the inexorable sense of loneliness that prevails in space. In other words, we are so small, and our world, as viewed from billions of miles away, as you said, is a small blue marble, and yet.
Well, you can't even tell it's blue when you're that far away. It's just a speck of dust,
true.
right?
This is true. But it ought to cause us to come together, to huddle together in our small little tiny planet in space, and do what we can to make life better for each other.
Don't
But
you
we
think,
don't do
Jim,
that.
unfortunately, yeah, because the forces of greed supersede this concept that you've described.
Mhm.
And the energy companies and the Koch brothers are not going to lose their grasp on these obscene incomes that they have in order to preserve a planet that they won't be here to live on 100 years from now.
But you would think that they would be more mindful of what their descendants are going to have to deal with. They're biological beings, just as working people and those of us right here and now.
You're right, I would
So-
think that, but obviously they don't.
No,
You know,
no,
they don't care.
They're focused on the quarterly
I would think-
profit report.
Yeah, the P&L
I would think that my own will is an example of the legacy that these gentlemen are willing to leave. I have left the sum of up to $150 million to all of my heirs and assigns, based solely on their picking the correct 8 numbers.
Mhm. That sounds pretty exciting, all right.
Well, the other thing about the
It's the same thing that we're being offered by the people who think that
Yes.
global warming is a hoax and things of that nature. It's the same bet.
Now, just any old numbers, or they have to pick them in the correct order?
No, they can be in any order. It doesn't
Oh, I
matter.
see. And you stand behind this guarantee?
I do, yes.
Excellent.
exactly. The other thing that took place on Apollo 8, which was, again, that was the first shot that actually took the humans up to circle the moon and then come back, was that on Christmas Eve they wanted to say something very, I don't know, evocative of the experience.
Mhm.
And none of them could really come up with anything because these guys were astronauts. They weren't writers or, poets or deep thinkers. They were technicians. So one of them finally came up with the idea of reading from Genesis on Christmas Eve and transmitting this message to the whole world, because everybody, really, as many people as could, were watching this because they were so fascinated. It's the first time humans had gotten out of Earth's orbit. And it strikes me how ironic it is that here they are reading a book of mythology while they're simultaneously executing the most advanced scientific experiment that the human species had ever conducted. Of course, some people complain, but back then it was still sort of the social thinking that we all subscribed to gods, that we were all believers in Christianity, even though that was then and continues to be the minority religion in the world, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I'm
most
not
about
sure
it.
in the world, certainly
No,
here it is.
It's the largest religion in the world, but it's still only about 1/3 of the people on the
Okay,
planet.
I
So
thought-
it's
I thought the
the
Muslim
vast
religion was-
majority of people on this planet would disagree with the statement that Jesus is Lord.
Yeah, and how
Although
the
that
Earth
wasn't
came to
part of
be,
the-
right? Yeah.
Yeah, of the,
Right.
Genesis
or that-
statement,
that
but
God
nevertheless.
called the universe into being, but the power of a word.
It's just kind of insulting to the science that they were implementing
yes, it is.
to incorporate this mythology into it, as if everything was only a few thousand years old.
Well,
And they
there's
wanted
some-
to claim that they were looking out into the void. They weren't. The
Right.
void was well filled.
Right.
I mean, it was widely dispersed, and there was a lot of nothingness.
Right.
But still, there was a good deal out there, and there was.
Well, at that time, they didn't realize that the known universe was 13.9 billion light years across.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
relatively tiny, only a few 100,000.
Besides the visual emptiness and vacancy of space, this just solid black background punctuated by stars, is the the audio emptiness of it too, which when I saw the film called First Man, which was about Neil Armstrong and his co-astronaut landing on the moon, the thing that struck me is when they landed, they of course had an atmosphere in the lunar lander, right, so they could breathe. So they suited up, finally ready to go out, and when they opened the door, we hear this rush of air leaving, and then everything just total silence. And the only thing they would hear is anything, either within their spacesuits or the radios. But all of a sudden, you had this just
sound.
absolute silence on the moon.
Sound basically travels by osmosis, and if there's no atmosphere for it to travel through.
So as they're walking around, not only is the sky just a total, absolute blackness and void, but also there's no sound to go along with it.
It's an utterly alien,
Yes.
non-human environment. Nothing like we could ever have
hostile
experienced
thing.
before.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's also, as I remarked before, the inexpressible poignancy of being alone. For the first
Yes.
time, humans were truly alone on the moon, especially Neil Armstrong, the first man out there on the surface, no one else. So how do you express that then? Only a poet like Archibald MacLeish, with sufficient imagination, could come up with a way of discussing that experience. And it's an experience which can be shared by all humankind, thanks to the technology that not only got us to the moon, but also allowed transmissions of pictures and verbal communication to and from the moon. So, and we're looking at an era opening up before us now that's going to allow even more of that. We're talking about visiting the moon again, about going to Mars, and we're even talking about perhaps terraforming other moons
Yes.
and the planets of other stars, but that's a lot further on, needless to say.
Technology started by Nikola Tesla, the idea of being able to talk without being connected by wire, communicate.
Your favorite
Without-
inventor.
Well, he had
Makes a
some
great
great
car.
ideas.
And one of mine too, yes, yes. It
Sure. The spiraling ribbons of clouds foreshadow the extreme weather to come. In the foreground, the gray moon testifies to how unforgiving the laws of nature can be. And behind the camera, so to speak, is the sprawling apparatus of the modern industrial age, spewing an insulating layer of haze around that little blue marble, the only home we've ever known.
Smog.
Yeah, exactly. Pollution and so on. That is really changing the climate of this planet, I think, faster than the scientific community had predicted it would.
If only we could
remember
find some way of communicating that to larger and larger numbers of people before it's too late. And already we're experiencing symptoms and problems in the environment.
It seems that a number of the astronauts were quite religious. I can't remember by name, but one of them participated in a quest to locate Noah's Ark on top of Mount Ararat.
Sure. Mitchell, I think that was.
They actually, physically went there and helped look for him.
But as you pointed out, Ed, Mitchell was in fact kind of a technician and a pilot, not necessarily a scientist.
And anybody that could get into the
thinker.
astronaut corps had to fit this image of the American hero, right? So he had to be a white guy. He had to be, most of them had military background. Armstrong didn't. Had to be a Christian, right? Most were married. I think one or two of them were not. But
I don't think they would require them to be Christians.
Well, but that's who they would have
most of them were.
selected, right? I mean, can you imagine?
Not de facto, or not formally, but
Yeah,
de facto.
exactly. Right.
Yeah, and you know how extensively they would know the backgrounds of all these candidates. No blacks, no women's, no Native Indian. They all fit this mold of the American hero. And it was quite a few years before we got past that. I guess it was into the space shuttle when we finally started diversifying the astronauts.
Yeah,
We actually
that's
even had a
interesting
female
because
commander.
The first man who stepped on the moon, what was his last name? Armstrong. Did you get any more American than that?
Right.
We'd like to tell you a little bit about an organization in the area that caters to atheists and those of us who are adamant supporters of the concept of state-church separation, keeping the government out of religion and all of its programs too. And then we're going to come back to talk a little bit about Trump's selection for the Attorney General, a fellow named William Barr, and how he wants to take America back to the 18th century. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. 2:30 on the Tan Talk Radio Network, 2:32. Ed Golly with Jim Peterson and Joe Reinhardt in the Tan Talk Radio Network with the Atheist Forum. That's right, real live atheists, not afraid to admit it. Joe Reinhardt, you've got our quote for the day, I believe.
I do, and courtesy of
Another
the
belief
comedian,
system.
Stephen Wright. It's short and sweet, and it is. A clear conscience is usually the sign of a bad memory.
The Trump administration currently has 5 vacancies in cabinet positions, each of which requires Senate approval to be filled. This is historic. He loves to be the most historic president in the nation, and has done so by having such a dysfunctional cabinet. He has selected a fellow named William Barr to become the next Attorney General of the United States. In 1995, this fellow Barr blamed secular government for everything from rising crime to STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and called for subsidizing religious schools to turn back the assault on traditional values. Traditional values, that's really interesting. That includes slavery, oppression of women who didn't have the right to vote when this country was formed, the oppression of children.
Whistle for LGBT rights, gay marriage, anything having to do with sexual freedom.
Exactly. In an essay that he wrote in 1995, Barr expressed an extreme view that American government should not be secular, but instead should impose, quote, a transcendent moral order with objective standards of right and wrong that flows from God's eternal law, unquote. This means to me he is automatically disqualified. If he doesn't understand that our Constitution establishes a government in which religion plays no role, then he's disqualified to be a member of the cabinet. It's as simple as that. It says it plain and clear in the First Amendment. Congress will make no law, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and that's exactly what he's trying to do.
Well, just to cite one small example of how it's sometimes difficult to discern exactly what God's eternal law is and how he wants it implemented. An example of that is the fact that there are over 35,000 different Christian denominations who themselves can't seem to agree on exactly what God's eternal law is. Can you imagine the chaos that would ensue if we tried to legislate, enact legislation to live by that, and the fiat of the moment?
That's what I call diversity.
Yeah. Well, that's one word for
But
it. Too kind.
In 1990, Mr. Barr gave a speech in which he is quoted as saying, "The American government was predicated precisely on the Judeo-Christian system that flows from God's eternal law, but since the 1960s, the state no longer sees itself as a moral institution, but a secular one." And to my mind, I think that's a false comparison. There's no competing alternatives. In other words, morality and secularism are not competing with each other. you can have moral secularism
Yeah, that's a great point.
and secular moralism, I
Well,
guess.
he says here that decades ago, we saw the barriers to divorce eliminated.
Yes, he did say
Keeping
that.
in mind that it was Jesus himself who told us that the only cause for divorce was infidelity, and by that he meant infidelity on the part of the woman, not on the part of the man. And you can imagine the misery that millions of women were condemned to by being inextricably shackled to some violent, abusing thug who either he nor she could prove infidelity.
And these are, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, Jim, that what you were quoting him as saying, though, about the government and the country being founded on Christian principles, if that were true, the country would be a kingdom, because nowhere in Christianity is any kind of a constitution defined, any kind of a republic, any kind of democracy. The concept of the governed being able to have any influence over those who govern is totally, completely, and absolutely foreign to Christianity.
There are two books of Kings, and there are numerous accounts of the Hebrew people clamoring for a king. They wanted a king. They wanted God to send them a king.
And there are no books of Democrats.
In fact,
No, the word compromise can't be found
No, I
anywhere
think
in the
not.
Bible.
there were some Americans that thought Washington should become a king, right?
Yes,
and
yes,
it was
there were.
resoundingly rejected by the majority of those who had been instrumental in putting together the Constitution to say, you know, that hadn't been working in Western Europe. Let's start over.
Right. And again, if our laws were based on these religious principles that he's so proud of, there would be restrictions on what you could do on Sundays. There would be fewer restrictions on how many wives you could have. Certainly, Solomon had hundreds of them and hundreds of concubines. He was the smartest man that ever lived. Who might argue with that?
Yes, who could?
Yes,
But
exactly.
you know, these are all traditional values, and it gives a great weight to the notion of tradition. And as you pointed out so well, and I think Ed mentioned too, this whole notion of adhering to traditional values flies directly in conflict with the present notion of the evolving nature of human society and human beings. We are more capable now. We have more understanding both of the universe through science and ourselves than we've ever had before. And it's through this understanding that we can construct a better, more humane society, which causes less pain than previous societies have ever been able to achieve, clinging to their traditional values.
Well, any social value that can't be defended morally is typically called a traditional value. And by the same token, just as when they put up religious icons in public places or Christmas displays, they say, oh, well, it's a tradition or it's history or whatever. I call it lying for Jesus, but the Bible says that, you know, it's okay to tell untruths.
Well, this is
if
this
it
is-
advances the cause.
That's right.
The
And
Quran,
this is
the Quran agrees with that.
an example of a modern moral value, because we give heavy weight. I mean, atheists per se believe strongly in morality, that is, in personal relationships and public policy that is oriented in a certain way to deliver a maximum capacity for human happiness, and which previous social systems, political ideas, and so forth have not. And we're always aiming for this, and we take this as being the moral center of what human culture should be about. I don't see that adhering to 3-century-old notions about how people should behave with each other based on nothing more than mythology should have any weight in our culture, which has advanced considerably in 300 years.
And yet that's exactly the puritanical view that this fellow expresses, claiming that the last 50 years of American history, he complains that since the mid-1960s, there's been a steady and mounting assault on traditional values. And as a result of that assault, he writes, We've lived through 30 years of permissiveness, the sexual revolution, and the drug culture. We've had unprecedented violence. We have had soaring juvenile crime, widespread drug addiction, and skyrocketing venereal diseases. And of course, we've also lived through the civil rights movement,
Yeah,
the
those
cultural
things
flowering
were-
of the 60s and 70s, and the partial liberation of women and LGBT people. These, of course, are unmentioned.
Yes, but he fails to prove or even assert that all of these evils and acts of degeneracy are apart from the traditional values as opposed to a consequence of them.
That's right. They are just as traditional. Those the evils of slavery and oppression and every other evil you can think of were well practiced in the past, especially when religion was predominant as a social arbiter.
I don't think there's any new evils.
No, I don't
come
think so.
along lately.
No, I don't know. But we're all pretty creative. We can come up with something. But we're trying to do the opposite. We really want.
How about it, caller? You got a new evil for us? It's
Yeah,
441-3000. Call in right now. We can sure use all the evil we can get here at Atheists of Florida.
Well, it's the holiday season. We suffer through the same traditional holiday films every year. One of them that we can't seem to get enough of is the Frank Capra, or as you call him, the Capricorn producer.
Capricorn.
It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Kimmel decided to explore what it might be like if Fox News was to produce a trailer for It's a Wonderful Life by today's standards. Who would be the protagonist and who would be the bad guy? Let's listen in and see what they came up with.
Christmas, rediscover the heartwarming story of the sleepy, economically backwoods town of Bedford Falls.
Nobody ever changes here, you know that.
And its one extraordinary citizen, Henry Potter.
I may lose a fortune, but I am willing to guarantee your people too.
This capitalist had a dream to transform Bedford Falls into a modern entertainment and business mecca, creating hundreds of new jobs. But one man would stand in his way.
You remember me, George Bailey?
Draft dodger George Bailey and his socialist building and loan.
We've got to have faith in each other.
Will Henry Potter's common sense reforms win the day?
What does that get us? A discontented, lazy rabble instead of a thrifty working class.
Or will George Bailey succeed with his scheme to redistribute wealth?
They had to wait and save their money before they even thought of a decent home? Wait for what?
How far will Bailey go to destroy free markets and economic progress? How low will he sink?
Where's that money, you silly, stupid old fool?
This Christmas, enjoy a classic as it was meant to be understood. Fox News presents Mr. Potter and the Commies of Bedford Falls.
Well, you know, even though the main theme of the story is the opportunity for this guy, George Bailey, to see how his seemingly unsuccessful life has altered the course of his own town and the people he encountered in life, it leads me to wonder how conservatives appraise the film and whether they consider Bailey to be the film's antagonist and Potter the hero. Because after all, Potter ended up with the misplaced $8,000, coughed up by the struggling townspeople to compensate Bailey for his idiot Uncle Billy's incompetence, while the already wealthy Potter ends up with a tax-free cash windfall, right? And introduced me to any modern-day Wall Street banker who would not second Potter's motion to dissolve the building and loan for its lack of profitability. And I'll show you a banker standing on a street corner with a cardboard sign and a tin cup.
Jump.
Yeah, you know, I mean, that's
On
what
the street corner?
that's what Wall Street's
Jump
all
out in
about.
front of a bus, at
Oh,
least.
all right.
But it's interesting to me that Bailey couldn't have done anything, any of these things on his own. He's powerless. He's ready to jump off of a bridge. But luckily, he has a supernatural friend.
Guardian angel.
And for those of you who don't have supernatural friends, either visible or otherwise, you're just out of luck, I guess. And my advice would be don't borrow any money.
Do we really have to wait for an angel from heaven in order to think up some ideas of how to deal with our problems in our society.
Well, you know, the guy, I mean, in the stories at the end of his rope, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because he didn't realize that Uncle Billy had lost the money, so he was assuming responsibility. Potter knew that Bailey wasn't responsible, yet
That's
he
right.
was such a capitalist of integrity that he wouldn't come forward and say anything. Instead, he was going to seize the opportunity to get him thrown in jail so he could crush the building and loan and then exploit the population. Potter was sort of the Gordon Gekko of Bedford Falls and applied his system for the benefit of his unbridled greed.
This is beginning to sound somewhat familiar.
Keep in mind another little irony, and that is, you know, Bailey makes his living as a usurer, which lending money is very anti-biblical. One of the reasons that the Jews dominated the banking industry was that the Christians more or less just gave them the banking industry because it was sinful and they were going to hell anyway.
It's sinful to loan money, right? Yeah.
To loan money at interest.
Although it must be said, however, that the organization in question was the Building and Loan Society. So in other words, it wasn't devised to accumulate large profits, but rather to enable the members, like a credit union. A credit union will generate, any economic enterprise will generate profits. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's not the sole and exclusive object of the organization. And George Bailey, I think, exemplified a very idealistic way of going about the process, and certainly it shows that he had a good deal of personal integrity and was socially conscious. He was, in other words, a decent human being.
He was, and of course his adversary was Potter, Henry Potter,
yeah.
made his fortune off the backs of the middle-class workers of Bedford Falls, and their slumlord, right? And he lacked any compassion for those who encountered the slightest financial misfortune, always seeking to foreclose immediately on the downtrodden for his unquenchable profit motive, in spite of the fact that he owned everything in Bedford Falls except the building and loan.
It's
Now,
never
Jimmy,
enough,
do
is
we
it?
find any noticeable similarity between Potter and the current occupant of the White House, or more specifically his father, who generated the family fortune for his son to inherit? Fred Trump was
That's
a
right.
slumlord.
Yes, he was.
Right? So anyway, I just think it's kind of a curious sidebar of the film to look at how Bailey was considered the hero, even though he had to set aside his own ambitions for the benefit of the working people whom he could put into comfortable homes in his life during his lifetime as a result of his work, so that they wouldn't need to live in Potter's slums, overpriced slums.
There's something called Potter's Field, as I
Yes.
recall. Having to do with the burial place of poor people.
Well, yeah, but anyway, it's just kind of a curious to me to wonder how it seems that it's always the conservatives and the religious right that are so opposed to socialism, and yet in this film we see the expression of the most blatant form of capitalism exploiting the entire town and keeping these people crushed, while the hero is the guy who is able to give them a higher standard of living without having to enrich himself any more than the rest of them, just because to him it was the right thing to do. I think his father expressed it, at the dinner table when he said,
Yes.
well, we actually, in our own way, we are doing big things. We're not building bridges and dams and airports, but we're really doing something constructive for the people. And yet, isn't this the message of the purported Jesus Christ? And yet the conservatives are so opposed to this idea.
Well, we know
in
it's a
their
fantasy
religious
because
philosophy.
it's basically a story about a banker who has your best interest
Yeah,
at heart.
that's what I said. Any banker does
Don't
that.
tell my mother I'm a banker.
Jeez.
She thinks I play the piano in a whorehouse.
Well,
A righteous living.
it's exactly what we saw in 2006 and 7. The bankers putting these mortgages together. when my dad took out a loan to have a home built in 1956, the savings and loan that provided the loan to him expected him to pay it off, and eventually he did. But by 2006, the banks were selling the mortgages before the ink was dry on them to grab their profit, and they didn't care if the mortgage could be satisfied or not. They just wanted their instant profit. So these were all put together in these bundles that the ratings agencies misrated, because they said, well, gee, if you're dumb enough to believe what our ratings are, that's your problem. We just pick a number. We just pull a number out of air.
And is this something that rarely happens when people are not being held accountable for their activities?
I think it is. I think we live in a society where the play is very loose. That is, people are able to, and we regularly see it all the time. I get telephone calls from people who want to scam me.
Yeah.
I get them 24 hours a day, every day. It's a terrible thing, and you get it in the mail, and you get it everywhere. Politicians are full of it. Corruption and dishonesty are characteristic of our society, as it probably never has been before. And yet, at the same time, people generally aspire to a decent standard of life, and they aspire to good relations with their fellow human beings, and they don't want harm to come to anyone. And yet, we have another considerable class of people, a smaller class by any measure, but that it was willing to exploit them, willing to exploit human beings and their greatest aspirations.
And they seem to be pretty industrious. I mean, they work pretty hard.
Oh, they do.
They're inspired, I would have to say.
It makes one
Motivated.
shudder to think what Potter could have made if he'd have thought of the derivatives, right, with mortgages.
Yeah,
Right, he could have got.
Well, now keep in mind, this is 1946.
A
when this
hostile
movie was made.
takeover is even better. I mean, you just buy everything, and sell all the assets, put everybody out of work, and put the money in your pocket,
Yeah.
and then throw the shell away.
This movie was made in 1946, and it didn't do well when it first came out. It didn't even reach the break-even point.
Wasn't it released during the summer too? It really wasn't considered a
Christmas
holiday
movie,
film.
yeah.
Christmas, yeah. In fact, the same story would have happened if it had happened in April,
Yeah.
right?
But I wonder what it says about us that from that humble beginning, it is now regarded as one of the most outstanding American classics as far as movies are concerned, and it's more popular now than it ever has been before. And what does this say about who we are? It's a very confusing picture in many ways, because people will look at It's a Wonderful Life and say, well, there are many truths here, many things to emulate, and then they'll go out and vote for Trump.
Yeah, but I'm not going to live
How
that
does
way.
that
Yeah, I'm playing the lottery. Well, you're absolutely right. That's the point of the whole conversation, is that when one evaluates the substance of the story, it is projecting this image of people caring about their fellow humans and working to help all of us have a better life, and yet socialism is such a widely condemned concept in this country. So how does other than the fact that RKO bungled the copyright on the picture so that everybody, all these local TV stations could show it every hour during the Christmas season without having to pay royalties on it, it still became popular simply because of that message, that underlying message of compassion for that Bailey had for the townspeople, and that they then in turn returned to him when he thought that he simply had no option left other than suicide.
I think it was probably the influence of the fact that the screenplay was authored by some of the Hollywood 10. That is, writers accused of harboring communist sympathies.
Oh, they've been blacklisted.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
That's right.
Wow.
And yet now it seems like this is a 100% all-American film. And it is, in fact. I mean, these writers harbored wonderful ideals. And it just goes to show you that communism as a political movement gave expression to certain ideals that I think are very compatible with what any progressively minded person would think. And even though it's a dream that never came true in terms of its expression in the Soviet Union and other socialist states and all that, nevertheless, it gave us that vision, and it's part and parcel of what it means to be an American now in so many ways.
And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If there was any system of economics that fits the model of what Christianity is purported to be in our culture, it would be socialism or even communism. Capitalism would be the exact antithesis of what
So
this
either
Jesus
one are much
advocated.
better on paper, but and they're economic systems as opposed to political systems. In order for an economic system to function and to succeed, it needs a sympathetic political system. And so, unfortunately, many of the countries that have tried socialism or communism have been run by people who were rapacious.
Well, they ended up like North Korea.
Beyond the norm, and basically ate the revolution.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, a capitalist just got his dividends. Okay, guys, we're out of time for now and for the year because we're ready to wrap up. So if you've got any final statements, comments, questions, insults for our audience, Joe, this is your big chance. If not, we'll be back, next week. We got some great guests lined up for January. So tell your...
More excitement and thrills than you deserve.
I just want to thank everyone for listening or viewing, people who have called in, people who have communicated with us in other ways. Atheism really is the high moral ground. It's the home for people who are most honest with themselves. You would do well to study it. You would do well to join us. We'd love to have you.
And you can find us easily on the internet at
Happy New Year.
Atheists of Florida. Atheists of Florida.com, where you can see all the different activities, social events. If you just want to get together with some atheists sometime, maybe you're exploring this whole concept and you'd
We
like
won't
to hear
bite.
something besides whatever you're told from the people who are trying to sell you 14th century mythology for profit.
None of us have been struck by lightning in weeks.
So anyway, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody you know about the Atheist Forum,
They're the
or
same
simply
people.
listen. To help, you'll join us again next week now, along with Joe Reinhardt and Jim Peterson. I'm Ed Golly, reminding you if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it. Just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
You have been listening to the Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. And join us again next Friday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.
WTAN, Clearwater,
FM 106.1,
WDCF, Dade City, Tampa Bay, WZHR, Zephyr Hills.
FM 104.3.
Listen.
Yeah, that was the bellboy.
Where's the news? Pot up the news, Vaughn.
Oh, you don't care?
Can you help me, Jim?
Oh, yes, I can. And probably will.
What's the matter now?
I just
Oh,
have
somebody
trouble
was,
getting-
what did I do wrong now?
I just have trouble getting it.
It didn't do what? Oh, the bell. You wondered.
I don't know how to work it.